Armed men in tactical gear roaming U.S. streets. It sounds like a Hollywood script, but it's happening right now. Troops are patrolling neighborhoods, armored vehicles are prowling suburbs. It's not an invasion, it's the National Guard. But who are they, and how do they differ from the police? On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're breaking down the differences between the National Guard and law enforcement. Let's start with cops, seeing as they're likely to be a lot more familiar. After all, TV is full of cop dramas, not National Guard dramas. Policing is inherently local, working at a town or a district on a county level, or at the very most a state level. Anything that crosses between states becomes a federal issue, and that puts it in the sights of various agencies like the FBI, DEA, and U.S. Marshals, among others. But to really understand where the cops fit in, you have to look at the country they serve. America is huge. Even if you live there, you probably don't really understand the full scope of it. To the rest of the world, it's almost like 50 different countries. So the law enforcement needs of the nation are extremely complex, and they have to be dealt with on a number of different levels. There are almost 18,000 police agencies in the U.S., with over 600,000 sworn law enforcement employees as of 2023, and only 137,000 of them are federal. But even regular cops aren't a monolith. There is, of course, the classic beat cop. These are the uniformed officers that patrol the streets and respond to emergency calls. Most of the time, this will be a single neighborhood, depending on the size of the area where they serve. They'll observe and report any suspicious behavior, monitor for traffic violations and write up citations, take down witness reports in the event of a crime, respond to accidents, and of course arrest suspects. They will generally answer to other cops ranked detective or above, whose job it is to work with the suspects, the witnesses, evidence, and the prosecution in any possible case. That's where a lot of TV shows simplify the job just a little. Being a detective isn't just about solving the case. It's about gathering enough meaningful evidence to give the prosecution a strong case against the defendant. Similar to your average police officer is your sheriff's deputy. Police officers, or beat cops, serve a municipality, but a sheriff's deputy serves a county or an unincorporated area. This matters because, unlike a chief of police, a county sheriff is an elected position. This means that there is more accountability when it comes to the whims of Jane and Joe Public. Policing can be a very flexible thing. Tribal police have a jurisdiction over lands owned by First Nations Americans. A lot of the larger universities across the country also have their own police force. There's also rail transit police and, of course, highway patrol. These cops and sheriff deputies are always there. They are the metaphorical boots on the ground of whatever their jurisdiction is, and always just one call from dispatch away. They work for chiefs, mayors, senators, and governors. But at that same time, they work for the public. If you're a victim of crime, the cops are always going to be there. The National Guard, on the other hand, are a whole different ballgame. It was first established in 1636 as the English colonial militia, carrying over the tradition of civilian soldiers banding together to defend their communities. Once the U.S. won its independence, the state militias remained, hoping to supplement the work of other local law enforcement. In 1903, the Militia Act, also unfortunately known as the Dick Act, along with the National Defense Act of 1916, formally ratified what we now know as the National Guard. It's a branch of the U.S. military, but here is the first important distinction: the National Guard is not a standing army. Like the U.S. Army or the Air Force, they're a reserve force with members that also hold down other civilian occupations. They also have an equivalent division under the Air Force, known as the Air National Guard. How is it possible to be a member of a group like this while also holding down a civilian job? Well, the commitment isn't that extreme. Most members only need 1 weekend of training per month and a few weeks of service per year. Basically, anyone can join the National Guard. But like any branch of the military, you need to pass stringent background checks as well as mental and physical tests. It's not uncommon for soldiers who've completed their military service to join up with the Guard so they can reapply their skills that they've already learned in their military careers. All of these branches are tightly connected. National Guard members provide 40% of the Army's combat power and 43% of its aircraft. And while the Guard are smaller than cops in the U.S., there are still around 430,000 members, all ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. But what kind of moment calls for National Guard intervention? Well, it's a simple question with a pretty complicated answer. The Guard is pretty distinct in how it denies a lot of traditional categories. They can operate inside the U.S. or overseas, depending on the orders they're given. They're split into contingents by state and they work under the orders of that state's governor. but under special circumstances, they can be federalized and work directly under the orders of the president. One exception to the governor rule is the DC National Guard, which works solely for the president. Compared to all the other branches of the U.S. government, the National Guard, both Army and Air, is a real Swiss Army knife in terms of when and how they can be deployed. Essentially, when the U.S. government needs large numbers of trained, well-equipped personnel, whether for disaster relief, border security, or maintaining order, the National Guard is on call. On a federal level, the boss of the National Guard, basically answering to the president, is the National Guard Bureau. This is always headed by a 4-star general from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In other words, someone with real command bona fides. Of course, having brass at the top only matters if the Guard can deliver when it counts. Back in 2005, Hurricane Katrina proved to be one of the worst national tragedies in U.S. history. It required 50,000 National Guard troops drawn from every state in the U.S. to be deployed to New Orleans to assist relief efforts. During the catastrophic 2023 Maui wildfires in Hawaii, the Hawaii National Guard was deployed to assist in evacuation and backing up firefighters going toe-to-toe with the blaze. They did the same in California during the raging wildfires early in 2025. Naturally, their assistance is extremely useful during the hurricane season that batters the southeastern U.S. every year. Back in 2024, during the ravages of the record-breaking Hurricane Milton, over 11,000 National Guard troops were sent in to maintain order, assist in evacuations, and distribute aid, all in collaboration with local law enforcement in the affected areas. And earth, wind, and fire aren't the only natural disasters that the National Guard are called upon to help with. Back in 2020, during the absolute worst months of the COVID-19 pandemic, they helped to make sure the November elections ran smoothly, despite the disruptions that lockdowns and social distancing caused. They had plainclothes members manning polling places. They figured doing so while in military uniforms might intimidate voters. And in recent years, they've also helped beef up cybersecurity for local and state elections. And during the 2024 election, they were deployed to prevent threats against voting infrastructure after ballot boxes were attacked and burned in Washington and Oregon. In recent years, they've also maintained a presence at the U.S. southern border. But what about the Guard's international duties? Seeing as that is the clearest way that they seriously differ from America's domestic law enforcement services. Overseas, the Guard typically serves under active duty commanders. These are the career soldiers whose full-time service brings a level of training and experience that part-time weekend warriors can't always match. But despite the distinction, Guard troops working abroad can end up in the same roles and risks as your standard soldiers. They have fought in every U.S. conflict since the Revolutionary War, with some insane stories along the way. The famous Harlem Hellfighters, a unit of highly effective black soldiers drawn from the New York Guard, proved their battlefield efficacy in World War I. National Guardsmen were also there during the D-Day landings of World War II. They also deployed alongside active duty troops in both Vietnam and Gulf Wars under the total force policy for both combat and humanitarian missions. International relations after the fall of the USSR also heavily involved the National Guard, coinciding with the birth of the State Partnership Program. This program paired up National Guards of different states with the militaries of allied nations. The National Guard of Pennsylvania allied with Lithuania, Michigan teamed up with Latvia, and Maryland with Estonia. This program is still going strong today, partnering with 115 countries spread across 5 continents. It makes the National Guard forces a real asset to the U.S.'s geopolitical relationships across the world. These days, at any given time, there are around 20,000 members of the Guard stationed outside of the U.S. Since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, over 1 million members of the National Guard have been deployed overseas in different capacities. Most recently, the Air Guard has come in clutch in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, gathering intelligence and sending it to America's allies in Europe. The Air Guard has also become more and more active in the military's drone operations from Ukraine to the Middle East. That Middle East deployment in particular saw a truly exceptional number of National Guard boots on the ground. 1 in 6 U.S. troops killed in the Iraq War, for example, were from the National Guard. But the National Guard's involvement in foreign intelligence hasn't come without its own set of issues and controversies as far as operational security is concerned. Back in 2023, Jack Teixeira, a member of the Air Guard, was leaking classified documents for clout in a meme Discord server called Thug Shaker Central. This could be written off as rogue actions of one bad egg, but it raises concerns about allowing civilians access to some of the nation's most vital security information. After all, while Jack Teixeira was one guy with a Discord account, could a foreign government sweet-talk a Guard member and get the keys to the intelligence kingdom? It's not exactly a concern with your average beat cop. Speaking of the Guard and beat cops, let's get to the juiciest part of all: deployment of the National Guard on U.S. soil for law enforcement. Why is it more controversial than ordinary police on the streets during hard times? Well, there are a few important reasons. When the National Guard's deployed domestically, it is less for law enforcement and more for events that could cause mass chaos or threaten national security. A perfect example came in 2021 when 25,000 Guard troops were deployed to Washington, D.C. after the January 6th insurrection. Their mission was to prevent further violence and deter potential copycat attacks. But the exact terms of when the National Guard can and should be deployed can be pretty controversial, to say the least. Most of the time, the president doesn't have the grounds to deploy the military inside the U.S. That's due to a piece of 1878 legislation called the Posse Comitatus Act. This act limits federal powers from ordering the Army to execute the law in the U.S., but there are exceptions. The main legal mechanism for the president taking the reins of the National Guard is the Insurrection Act of 1807. This allows the U.S. military to operate in domestic peacekeeping operations in the event of a rebellion or other forms of major social unrest. But that's not the only way it can be done. Title 10 of the United States Code dictates that the president can put the National Guard under federal control under 3 conditions: when the U.S. is invaded or in danger of invasion, when there is a rebellion or danger of rebellion against the authority of the U.S. government, or when the president is unable to, quote, execute the laws of the United States with regular forces. Of course, the presidency has gotten a little more wiggle room on National Guard deployment in the last few decades. The John Warner National Defense Authorization Act of 2007 saw an expansion of federal authority over the Guard in times of national crisis, like natural disasters, health crisis, or terrorist attacks. Though critics have pointed out that terrorist attacks can be made a very flexible term to suit an administration's political conveniences. While deployments of the National Guard are often logistically necessary, they can be used to show that the powers that be are taking an issue seriously. Armored vehicles rolling through the streets and men with assault rifles makes for an extremely effective projection of political power. Sometimes the National Guard has been deployed as a preventative measure for when violence is anticipated. 2 great examples of this are times when the National Guard intersected with the civil rights movement in a positive way. When schools were first desegregated in the Jim Crow South, the federal government anticipated that racist radicals would attack black children trying to integrate. To prevent this, President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard to ensure the Supreme Court's Brown v. the Board of Education ruling on desegregation was enforced. And Eisenhower wasn't the only one. President Kennedy did the exact same thing in both Alabama and Mississippi. He was convinced, and with good reason, that the states wouldn't desegregate their schools unless the U.S. military twisted their arms. One of the darkest moments in National Guard history occurred in 1970. That's when the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University gunned down and killed 4 college students peacefully protesting the Vietnam War. The Eisenhower and Kennedy incidents wouldn't be the last time when the National Guard played a part in trying to smooth over racial tensions. In 1992, the LA riots erupted after police officers caught on video beating Rodney King were acquitted of brutality charges. That and the murder of 15-year-old Natasha Harlins caused tensions to boil over into violence that would leave 63 dead and cause over $1 billion in damage. California Governor Pete Wilson asked President George H.W. Bush to deploy the National Guard under the Insurrection Act, and they moved in to help end the riots. This is the difference between police and the National Guard. The police were already there from the beginning. The National Guard were only brought in once the situation deteriorated. In 2020, as the nation struggled with the COVID-19 pandemic, the murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin ignited worldwide protests and civil unrest, the most in Minnesota, where the killing occurred. As violence escalated, the president urged Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to deploy the Minnesota National Guard to assist with crowd control and restoring order. With the Guard already deployed due to pandemic duties, Walz's call-up pushed the numbers even higher. This marked the largest troop deployment in U.S. history outside of wartime, and 2025 has seen the deployment of the National Guard in several major cities. Precedents are changing fast, and while the Guard and the police are still different worlds, the line between them keeps moving, and no one knows where it'll go next. We've broken down the difference between the National Guard and the police, but some of the craziest stories come from cops risking everything. Watch Crazy True Stories from Undercover Cops to hear what really happens on the job, or click on this video instead.